Hello and welcome to a look ahead at what the papers will be bringing us in the next few hours. We're joined by Katy, Deputy Political Editor at the Spectator magazine, and Sonia Sodha, Chief Leader Writer at The Observer. Welcome to you both. Let's just look through what's already come in. Britain's Daily Telegraph leads with concerns about the number of young people on benefits as the number of under 25s on universal credit almost doubled during the lockdown to more than 500,000 people. Guardian, two main stories on its front page. First story about England's exam results row, claims that the Education Secretary was made aware of problems weeks before the results day. Another story also about the latest restrictions in Scotland, in Glasgow, following a rise in coronavirus cases there. Le Figaro reports on French President Emmanuel Macron's return to Beirut following last month's blast. He said he was giving Lebanese political leaders a final chance to reform the country ahead of a donors conference in October. The international edition of the New York Times features the rise of coronavirus in Spain, which it reports is seeing the virus spread twice as fast as in the United States, almost 8 times as fast as it is in the UK and in Germany. The British edition of the FT looks at a renewed bid from Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon, looking very natty there in a tartan face covering, for independence from the UK. Right, let's kick off. Welcome to you both. Katy, should we start with the New York Times? You've got a lot of viewers around the world at the moment. Second virus wave grips Spain, and it makes the point that if Italy were the harbinger of the first wave, Spain seems to be the portent of the second.
Yes, I mean, Spain was hit very badly the first time around, but this is a report looking at the scenes in Spain, and one resident says there is a sense of deja vu occurring. We've known that cases in Spain are on the rise. Here in the UK, we had I think Spain one of the first countries to have an air bridge, so Brits being told they could go to Spain on holiday and then had that retracted. At the time, the government came under heavy criticism for doing it so abruptly. But I think there probably is a sense of feeling vindicated for that decision, because since then you have seen the rates go up significantly. And we know that it rises exponentially. Is why, in a way, you need 20 per 100,000. They've set it very low, the targets for quarantining and removing air bridges. But I think what it touches on here is admissions to hospitals, because one thing we've been hearing across Europe is cases going up, but hospital admissions not following in the way that perhaps they did in the first wave. Various factors that could be to do with that, including the young. But I think this is a reminder that, we can see things repeating themselves. And the big worry is that this is just the beginning. Spain was, eased lockdown for quite a few other European countries. So are we about to start seeing it happen in other parts of Europe, just as we did the first time? And I think that's a big concern in a lot of countries right now.
And Sonia, it is pretty ominous, isn't it? 440,000 cases. And I thought quite a striking, the pictures they'd used on the front as well. You've got a patient taken into emergencies in Malaga. Then underneath that, you've got a beach attendant straining under these sun lounger mattresses in, was it Torremolinos? Yeah, where, the beach bars and beachfronts have been absolutely crammed with people.
Yes, and I think the issue for Spain has been its economy is so reliant on tourism, which is why the Spanish government was really lobbying countries like the UK, which sends a lot of tourists to Spain every year, to put Spain on the safe list initially. And I mean, I think it is a real problem for economies that are so reliant on tourism. It puts them in a very difficult place. Do you reopen and try and save the economy? But obviously, a lot of people go to Spain, to go to the beach for the nightlife. Or do you sort of, still try and keep things like bars and nightclubs closed, for example? And that's been a really live issue of debate in Spain. But if you look at the infection rates now, they've really, really ticked up. It's now over 100,000. So it's far, far in excess of that sort of threshold that the government looks at. And I think there'll be a lot of people in the UK who look across to Spain and feel really worried, just in the same way that we were all looking across to Italy in late February. And I think it is very poignant, the quotes that we've got on the front there from relatives who sort of, some of whom have seen relatives go into hospital with very serious COVID symptoms in the first wave, only to find themselves there again. And I think everyone would just be hoping that that's a situation that hopefully other countries in Europe can avoid. But it doesn't bode well. It does show that you've got to act so quickly to act locally once there starts to be a sort of evident spike in infections to stop this thing spreading, because as Katy just said, we know it can grow exponentially very, very quickly.
Yeah, and a nightmare for anyone who's planning to go abroad on holiday at the last minute, because you just don't know where they stand. Let's go on to the Telegraph, Katy. Record number of young on benefits, universal credit claims doubling, but Rishi Sunak, he's got some more money.
Yes, we have a new scheme, no longer half-price food, but this is a scheme targeted at young adults ultimately, and it's the Kickstart scheme. It launches tomorrow, and ultimately it is to offer 6-month placements where the government will pay the wages to that age group. I think the hope is, because we know this group are so disadvantaged by the response to coronavirus. If you look at first lots of the sectors that the young tend to work in, so hospitality industry, things like that, which we know are badly affected. But secondly, people graduating right now, people finishing schools right now, looking for that way in, a lot harder for several reasons, including social distancing. Offices aren't really operating. And I think this is to try and help that. But while it will clearly do something, it is a very wide gap, ultimately, if you look at how far backwards we're going on some of these things. And I think if you look, again, quite sobering statistics in terms of the number of claims going up, and that's before the furlough scheme has even been completely wound down. So I do think it is looking fairly bleak, but Eat Out to Help Out, I think, surprised a lot of people, and perhaps the scheme will do that to a degree, but we need to see what type of placements and what type of positions people are going into, because it won't suit everyone.
Sonia, the Prime Minister in upbeat form today, talking about the huge numbers of people who'd gone back into the offices, but it doesn't seem to be supported by the data, does it?
No, it's rather unfortunate for Boris Johnson, actually. Just on the day he was saying, Britain's returning to work, lots of reasons for optimism. Actually, we saw new statistics from Transport for London in particular, showing that there's barely more Londoners commuting into work than there were last week, and that numbers are still 70% down.
Maybe they all cycled.
Maybe. I live in London. I didn't see loads more people on their bikes. So I think when you look at company data as well, who's back in the office, I think, companies are taking it much more slowly than the government would like. In my view, I sort of personally think that's right. I think we should be quite cautious about this. I think the last few months have shown that some people are able to and like working from home. So in many ways, the government wants to sort of save the city and urban economies and town centre economies by getting people back into those spaces. I think it would be better to take a more cautious approach, to have a targeted furlough scheme for the hospitality industry, those sorts of industries that are really hard hit in city and town centres, and to continue to encourage people to work from home if you can, because it leaves public transport networks, it leaves sort of city and town centre spaces for people who really do have to go to work because of the style of jobs that they do. So, I think the Prime Minister was trying to strike a bombastic tone, but it really isn't a case of back to business as usual, no matter how much he wishes that were the case.
No, Katy, I just want to touch on one. It's only a small story on the front of the Telegraph at the moment, but it's our lead on BBC World, actually. Trump comparing US rioters to terrorists, domestic terror, as he flies into Kenosha in the last few hours. Do you want to just talk about that? Because I suppose most people would think that traditional presidents would be going to a place like this to try and calm and embrace everyone there, but this isn't really Donald Trump's message.
No, I mean, we're clearly, building up to an election. And actually, when it comes to Wisconsin, there are Democrat politicians that suggested Donald Trump should not visit because it could inflame tensions, given the riots that have been taking place, the protests. But he decided to go anyway. And I think it touches on, clearly his message that he has moved to in this election campaign is to go strong on law and order, and looking at the protests that are taking place, what's happening on the streets. That clearly seems to be where he and his camp think they are going to have the best chance of winning over voters. So I think lots of people will take great issue with this, but I think you have to look at it through an electoral lens, probably, to see what he is trying to do here. But yes, you hear him talking about, comparing US rioters to domestic terrorists. And we've also had recently talking about policemen, and those who have been accused of shooting, of unnecessary force in relation to golfers. So, that
golf part analogy. We've got a few titles. If you don't mind, Sonia, can I just move us on a bit quickly now, just to try and get through a few more. We've got the Figaro. We've got Emmanuel Macron there, demanding sort of more from Lebanese political leaders ahead of this donors conference. What's that, mid-October? Slightly uncomfortable when you think of a French leader making demands of a former protectorate 100 years on. Do you think, after proclaiming the birth of a greater Lebanon?
Yeah, it is slightly uncomfortable, isn't it? And this is obviously the second trip that Macron has made to Lebanon since the awful explosion that we saw last month. Lebanon finds itself in a really tight spot. We had this explosion that caused, such damage, had a huge impact on the Lebanese economy, massive loss of life. And then at the same time, that really triggered a political crisis with the Lebanese government resigning. Lots of talk about the link between the corruption of the Lebanese government and what happened in the explosion, and the negligence that we saw that led to the explosion. So it is a really tricky, difficult time for Lebanon right now. Macron has clearly gone in there saying, I'm going to host another conference, we're going to try and get money in, but he's also sort of attaching riders to it and saying, there may be sanctions, for example, if the Lebanese government sort of doesn't get up and running. So it is uncomfortable territory, all right.
Katy, can I move us on? Guardian, Williamson warned weeks before Exams Fiasco. I thought I sort of knew this from other papers, or maybe it was even your magazine. I don't know. Does this seem totally new to you?
I think we've had reports previously about the various things Gavin Williamson and his team knew in advance of the off-court algorithm. And I think you've had various reports, different types of communications where bodies have come forward, individuals who contacted saying, we spot a problem. I think it's also worth noting that we had a public report. If you look at things that Robert Halfon, the chair of the Education Select Committee, said, pointing out potential problems. So I think that, generally speaking, I think there's plenty of evidence to suggest Gavin Williamson should have been aware there are problems coming up the track. But I think ultimately it does feel as though his position is secure for now, and Downing Street have decided to stick with him. And I think with the return of schools today and throughout the week, I think should that continue going to plan, I think that has, within number 10 is seen as his biggest test. Now they have U-turned on the A-levels.
Yeah, OK. Sonia, the restrictions in Glasgow after rise in virus cases there, that's the sidebar on the front page of The Guardian. Scotland reacting very quickly, but it's going to cause a lot of problems, isn't it, and inconvenience for people there.
Yeah, that's right. And, so we've got these three areas of Glasgow that are seeing similar levels of restrictions that we've seen in some areas of England, particularly in areas of the northwest. So people won't be able to visit other people's houses, although they can still meet up with other households outdoors and in gardens. And then the Scottish Government has also put in new restrictions for people returning from Greece, where there's been a spike in cases, particularly the island of Zante. So, it's difficult, but it's it's good. I think it's a sign that the Scottish government is keeping it, like the UK government, the government in Westminster is keeping an eye on local spikes and is taking action quickly, and that is absolutely critical. Interestingly, there's also controversy which the Guardian talks about inside its pages about the relaxations of restrictions in areas of the northwest in England. So Bolton and Trafford are set to see those extra restrictions loosened from Wednesday, and that's turned into a bit of a political fight because you've got local Labour leaders, local Labour politicians saying, well, actually infections are still really high. They're incredibly worried about it, and they're accusing the government of relaxing these restrictions basically to sort of keep local Tory MPs like Graham Brady, who's the MP for Trafford.
Yeah, and Katy, I mean, that's going to make things very awkward for the government, isn't it? If you've got local leaders saying, no, let's keep it in force.
Yeah, I think local lockdowns are going to become increasingly contentious as we go on, because we are going to be seeing more and more of them into the autumn and winter. And I do think the government has a problem in the sense that the first area, Leicester, the Tory MP there was Neil O'Brien, who is pretty seen as a loyalist. And I think even by the end of it, he was saying, tweeting things like, let us out of lockdown. So I think that when you have MPs who are more naturally anti-lockdown, or in other scenarios that we could see own tight Tory marginals, I think that does put pressure on the government, whether it is because they have to face down angry MPs, or it's an added pressure in terms of decision making.
20 seconds each on Nicola Sturgeon wearing her tartan face mask. Independence push renewed. Pretty symbolic, isn't it, Sonia? Nothing more than that.
It is. It's what we would expect from Sturgeon. There's elections in Holyrood next May, so she's setting out her stall on independence. It's always been the key issue for the SNP, so I'm not sure there's much surprise there, but I think we can expect a big showdown between the SNP and Boris Johnson in the months to come.
And Katy, how much pressure is it going to put on the Prime Minister?
I think it's huge pressure, and I think a big question of how does Westminster government best respond to this? Because the concern is if you keep saying no to independence and no to any referendum, do you just increase support? And I think that's something that ministers have to start thinking about.
And for the first time ever, I think opinion polls suggesting that that there might be more support for independence.
Yeah, I think we've seen Professor John Curtis's election gurus that there's now a consistent trend in polling towards independence. And I think that means that this message should appeal when you're looking at those Scottish Parliament elections. As soon as the SNP win a majority in those, I think things get more difficult for Boris Johnson's government in terms of saying no to entertaining the idea even of a second referendum.
Katy, Sonia, thank you both very much indeed. We must end our first look at the papers, but for some of our viewers watching in the UK on the news channel, they will be back in about 45 minutes' time. But that is our first look at the papers.